Good morning, everyone. We are the Group 6. We will going to tackle the Lesson 6. The Modern Principalia, the Historical Evolution of the Philippines Ruling Oligarchy. The Objectives. First, to trace the historical development of Philippines Principalia from Spain colonization to 21st century. Second, identify what are the social and economic and political characteristics of Principalia. Third, to analyze the challenges of presence of modern Principalia socially, politically in the Philippines. The definition of terms. Principalia. It talks about the social economic elite. It derived from the word principales or the principal, which means members of the community. The second term is the Philippine oligarchy, defined as government in which small groups exercise control, especially on corrupt and self-based purposes. So it is like in the Philippine government is being involved in oligarchy. The modern Principalia is about the Philippine ruling elite, who they are and how they evolved in history. It delves into their economic interest as well as their lifestyles, how they acquired their wealth and built a world of their own. It describes their family links and the interlocking interest with other elites and foreign partners. This Principalia emerged from the economic class nurtured by the Spanish colonizers to serve the latter's interest, and further endowed with political power by the Americans to cow the restive masses after the Filipino-American War. They were mostly composed of mestizos, native and Chinese, the former sired by the Spanish fathers and the latter offspring of Chinese merchants who intermarried with native women members of the Principalia. During pre-colonial period before Spanish colonization, Philippines were uncivilized and has already their system where they called barangay, the tribal gathering, and they have leader they call dato or chieftain. The dato had immense powers and exercised multifunctional roles. He was lawmaker, judge, chief executive, and military leader. As judge, was often assisted by a group of elders called maginoos who also belonged to the Maharlika class. He had control of the land, although the actual title was vested in the barangay. He also controlled trade, fishing, and etc. So there are three castes, which is the nobles or the maharlika, the commoners or the timawa, and slaves or the aliping na mamahay in aliping sa gigilid. The Magellan expedition leads to discovery, and the Spaniards came to the Philippines and colonized the Filipinos. In Spanish colonialism, when the Spaniards came in 1565, 4 decades after Magellan came to our country, the colonization by the Spaniards brought an end to absolute dominion of the ruling datos or their respective jurisdictions. The initial policy of the Spaniards in consolidating their political control was the adoption of the encomienda system. Under this system, vast areas of lands were apportioned among loyal and deserving Spaniards, who became known as encomenderos. The datos or cabeza de barangay and gobernadorcillos were employed the Spaniards as tribute collectors in the respective barangays. In order to keep the populace under their control, they need the upper class and were given the status of principalia, a member of a local nobility. Primarily, because of this treatment as a privileged group, the upper class began willingly agents of Spanish colonial administrations. The Principalia enjoyed official benefits and privileges. They are the only to allowed to vote, be elected to public office. They were exempted from paying tributes, taxes, or doing forced labor. This was composed of Principalia class, the hereditary cabeza, and the whole set of elective officials. Throughout Spanish rule of over 300 years, they monopolized public positions open to Filipino. They constituted the voting and privileged class in Filipino society. The changes of Principalia. The Principalia as a class, however, underwent some changes, apart from the local collaboration of the members with the conquerors as a result of the privileges they enjoyed under Pax Hispanic a relationship that separated them from their fellow countrymen. There were other changes that took place. Acquiring Spanish education and learning the Castilian language, they become different from their people, who were not given the same opportunities. Living in poblaciones or cabeceras, they became isolated from the masses of their countrymen. And the infusion of the mestizo elements resulting from the racial mixture between Spanish officials and prosperous Chinese merchants on the one hand, Filipino women on the other, produced the mestizo character not only in outlook and culture but also in physical features. The Chinese mestizos started to accumulate more and more lands with the use of pacto de retro, or deed of sale with rights to purchase. This kept the Indios to their serf status, and because of this, the Spaniards in 1768, there were laws against use of pacto de retro against Chinese and Chinese mestizos. And also, the opening of the port of Manila, a foreign trade in 1837 and other ports in 1855, this produced an expansion of Chinese and Chinese mestizos activities. There was an important consequence of this increased selling in regard to this wealth to the islands, and that is was not evenly distributed among the population, but went to in which certain families, largely Spanish and mestizos, as well as the old native aristocracy, the Principalia. That time, Chinese mestizo has taken his formal place in Principalia ranks by virtues of his wealth and prestige, resulting from such wealth. Aside from their skill money-making activities, they also loyal supporters of Spanish hegemony and the Philippines, like their other Principalia counterparts. And the Spanish mestizo and native aristocracy, they have become thoroughly Hispanized. Following the Spanish-American War in 1898, Spanish sovereignty over the Philippines came to an end. Only 76,627 people, or 1.6% of the population, had completed secondary education in 1903. 4 years after the Americans supplanted the Spaniards as colonizers, we might assume that the majority of these people were members of the Principalia. Education was neglected during the Spanish administration, and it was only afterwards that people began to think about popular education. When the Americans first came to power, they brought democracy and the republican system with them, formalizing the Principalia by permitting only landowners and educated people to vote, signaling that those with wealth and education were more to inclined with American rule. They also established the Pensionado program, which sent elite to prestigious universities to train as political leaders. And for the first time, political parties were allowed. It was built upon the clientelist interactions between the Filipino politicians and their American colonial patrons. Characteristic of most colonial regimes, the Americans implemented a system of indirect administration, utilizing dependable native clients. The measure of success for an American colonial official was their ability to cultivate and manipulate capable local clients in implementing American policies. Hence, the early political parties became the arena for factional infighting among the Filipino elites as they compete for colonial largesse. The first political party to be organized in the Philippines is the Federal Party. Was established in 1900s by Filipino politicians to facilitate clientelistic relationships with their American patrons. The party was organized long before the holding of the first national election under American colonial rule. It was founded by a faction of the local elites who defected from the Filipino revolutionary government established in Malolos in 1899. Led by Manila-based elites, Trinidad H. Pardo, Da Tavera, and Benito Legarda, this faction advocated autonomous government under an American protectorate. President Sergio Osmeña was the leader up to 1921. President Manuel Quezon started to challenge President Osmeña's personal leadership with the creation of Senate in the bicameral Philippine legislature in 1916. This personal fight went on until 1935 when there came about a fusion between the warring groups and Quezon's paramount dominance remained unquestioned until his death in America in 1944. During this later period, also a system of one-party government by the Nacionalista Party of Quezon Osmeña developed. Senator Juan Sumulong and attacking this one-party arrangement in Article 1935 entitled De Socis de la Coalición El Delivi. The system received the support of the rest of the Principalia. And he added that the oligarchy had been alternately under Osmeña and Quezon. Non-elite Filipinos who seek government positions are suppressed by this type of government system. And this system reflects the combined heritage of its historical development, the marked influence of traditional class system in which society was divided into a very small but powerful upper class aristocracy of hereditary mahalikas, a group of Timawas who owned allegiance to aristocracy, and a large lower-class groups of dependent and landless Alipins is still noticeable evident. In this traditional system, there was no pretense of equality, and people took it for granted that fate had placed them in position occupied. The Spanish influence is found in the attitudes and behavior of the upper class, such as their disdain for manual labor, their aloofness and aristocratic mien, and a domineering, although sometimes paternalistic, authoritarianism.
For the next part of our discussion, we'll be talking about the characteristics of the modern principality. In here, we will examine the post-war social and economic setting with the aim of determining what changes, if any, occurs which might have produced a rearrangement in the class structure. Did the old Principalia disappear? And was it replaced by a new one? In short, did a new elite class develop? In order for us to answer these questions, it is necessary to examine the nature of the Philippine social structure from the background of its environment. No society may be said to be truly static, for structures are generally in flux. Sociologists, however, speak of a changing society and a static society, depending on the presence or absence of certain dynamic factors that may produce social and economic changes resulting to re-stratification of the society. Well, we could say that our society is dynamic or changing based on the extremes of wealth and poverty, rapid industrialization, and an educational system open for all. But we could also say that it is static in the means that an aristocracy is still dominant in the social, political, and economic spheres of our society. Now let's start with the social characteristics. The Principalia back then were mostly composed of mestizos, native and Chinese, the former sired by Spanish fathers and the latter offsprings of the Chinese merchants who intermarried with native women members of the Principalia. The Chinese mestizos grew in economic status in Philippine society as they acquired haciendas, with crops meant for exports to Spain and later to other Western countries. The descendants of these Principalia is still lording over the socio-economic arena, with the likes of Aboitiz, Ayala, Cuanco, Lopez, and Arroyo, to name a few. This class interbreeds within itself, intermarrying within a limited circle of the so-called high society families. In Manila, it is referred to as the Manila's 400. The Manila's 400 is a list of 400 elite families made by Tarosa Subido in the 1950s. And as from what we can see, with this exclusiveness, the wealth of the Principalia remains or becomes more concentrated through time. This Principalia has a highly westernized outlook, now Americanized as benefiting their US patrons. They send their children to the same exclusive schools, such as Ateneo, La Salle, and Betran, and have interlocking businesses in companies and banks. Lastly, they have close connections with political leaders, since members of their clan may be holding public offices themselves, or they have minions in government to protect their interests. So that's it for the social characteristics.
So now for the political characteristics of the modern Principalia. The trend established by the Spaniards in setting up the Principalia class as a privileged group and a source of governadorcillos and other administrators was continued by the Americans. Americans, like the Spaniards, selected men from the Principalia class in the appointments office. In the elections that they introduced, they favored the property class, introducing property and literacy qualification to the franchise. And if you can remember, this was supposed to be at least around 500 pesos for you to vote. This resulted, of course, in the legitimization and further entrenchment in the power of the class. Thus, political democracy in the Philippines was founded and based from the beginning on Principalia superiority and dominance. Property qualification was removed in 1960, although the qualification still remains and the pattern has already been set. And so these are three features in the recruitment pattern. One, those elected or appointed directly to the top elite positions outside immediate and formal government hierarchy tend to come from the top or economic people. So we're talking like millionaire business lawyers from top schools and doctors. And the primary proof of this is second feature, which is will increase number of representatives who did not hold public positions prior to their entry to elite posts but follow the direct route. And lastly, there is no one branch career among the top power. There is a prevalence of moving from one governmental branch to another. There is no separation of powers in their development or group. So if let's say the Valia class was from judicial branch, they can just move to legislative or so this is the kind of their upper yeah they can have the or they can go through the direct route, the elite post government and lower principalia obviously they start from the bottom government hierarchy, and the only way for non-principalia class to part of this is to have higher education plus political patronage and economic success, whether in business or for have land owners created in the hands of nation published 5 was only 150 having farm holdings of 50 hectares. We're talking majority of the land in the should be noted that this does not even give the entire picture. Landowners showed that not a few of them belong. In several cases, the same person listed as having land ownership in the Philippines fact still carries with it values that elevate the landowner above the man. Enterprises, principles such as free market, arrangement, area as hence it is side by side with the agenda and the field of competition led by cap and a government field, but the widespread system liberally mixed them with the social is and I keep in public corporations, then turning it from a breeding ground, craft, craft and corrupt.
In this part of the report, we are going to discuss to you an example of a political dynasty, the Aquino family. So, I am not going to elaborate it that much because it might um, consume my limited time. So, I'm just going to give you a summary of these families' short timeline. So, the first one is Servillano Mianong Aquino. So, he is a soldier at the Philippine-American War, and because of his service, he became a delegate to the Malolos Congress, and he was also appointed by Emilio Aguinaldo, the first president of the Philippines. Now, he had three children from Guadalupe Quimbao. The first one is Gonzalo Aquino, Benigno Aquino Sr., and Amando Aquino Sr. So, in his children then came another famous politician, Benigno Simeon Igno Aquino Sr. So he also became a politician as well and became a House of Representative, a senator, a member of the National Assembly, and at the same time, Secretary of Agriculture and Commerce. And Simeon Aquino had two wives. The first one is Maria Orquico, and unfortunately, she died from cancer, and then he married again from his third cousin, Aurora Lampa Aquino. So in his first wife, they had four children, and on his second wife, they had seven children. And within that seven children, then came another famous politician, Benigno Simeon Jr. or Ninoy Aquino. So in this part of the timeline is where the Aquinos became powerful. So since Benigno Simeon Aquino had a good name of being an Aquino, he also married Corazon Sumulong Cuanco. So the Cuancos in their time are a powerful family since they own a huge part of the sugar industry in the Philippines. And so after the death of Benigno Simeon Aquino, Maria or Cory Aquino took place and became the 11th president of the Philippines. And now after her, then came Benigno Aquino III, their son, who became the 15th president of the Philippines. He also became the Secretary of the Interior and Local Government, a senator of the Philippines, a member of the House, Speaker, and a representative of the Philippines. So these are a few examples of the impact of the dynasty of the Aquinos. The first one is media control. So in their time, they basically control the media in where only the news that might not destroy their family will be released in the public. So an example of that is the Mindiola massacre. So the Mindiola massacre is a farmers' protest of the lack of government action on land reform. So what Cory did in this time is that she killed a lot of farmers instead of attaining their needs. And in her time, and also in the time of the Aquinos, this kind of news was not remembered because it might destroy their name. The second one is that she had ties with the elites. So I'm just going to give you a short example, like on how after the dictatorship of Marcos ended, she returned big businesses to his friends, like the Lopez. He gave back Meralco to the Lopez. And then the last one is corruption. So another example of corruption is that in the time of Aquino, even the plate numbers of cars cannot be afforded by the government. Instead, the people will have to improvise on making their own plate numbers. And then, according to Aquino, the reason why they cannot make plate numbers because the Philippine government had no money. So there really is a corruption in their time.
So hello everyone. To continue sa ating discussion, sa analysis and examples of the presence of modern Principalia, educational attainment, no? The exclusiveness of the wealthy Principalia becomes more concentrated through time, as we have seen in our discussions. With the non-elite Filipinos working hard to put food on the tables each day, others getting less than the minimum wage, the chances to get a proper education and getting out of poverty becomes less. The wealthy elite Filipinos or Principalia that has a highly westernized outlook, according to Simbulan, they send their children to the same exclusive schools like Ateneo, LaSalle, Letran, Assumption, University of Asia and Pacific, which they conduct their businesses and rich stuff. No? They are top-end schools that give them the proper education and experience to gain proper position in the office. Or at least give them the advantages to gain those positions. So, example of this would be Bongbong Marcos, where he went sa Lasal Green Hills sa iyang elementary years, apil kinder. Sa iyang high school years, niadto siya abroad sa Worth School. Sa iyang college, where nagkuha siya sa iyang degree sa philosophy, politics, and economics dito sa St. Edmund Hall sa Oxford. And nagkuha na po siya another degree sa business and administration sa Wharton School of Business sa University of Pennsylvania. Pero wala niya natiwas kay nag-withdraw daw siya para magdagan siya sa ilahang lugar. Dito po sa iyang college is isa ra ko na yung napasara ni nato sa degree which is ang philosophy. Wala siya nakapasar do ko sa politics o sa economics. So another example would be Benigno Simeon Cuanco Aquino III, where nag-attend gid siya from elementary hangtod nakagraduate siya sa iyang degree sa Ateneo de Manila University. So land ownerships. So in 1955, those owning lands in the Philippines above 50 hectares was 41.5% of the population. So more almost no 10 na 8.5 na lang kulang kay para mga 50%. Pero sa survey sa 1991, when the last survey of the Philippine land ownership was conducted by the National Statistics Office, this has decreased to 20.9% or almost by half. So dako gi kay ang difference. Okay. No, makita po ninyo sa table muna ang land ownership sa Philippines in 1943. Na siya category sa agriculture, non-agriculture, and commercial land. So sa wealth distribution naman, in 1960s daw no, the richest families had 11.1% of the total family income sa Philippines. So 11.1 lang. Pero in 2006, this has increased to 35.9% of the total family income. Dako kayang pag-increase. So may pasabot na ana. Though more than 40 years have passed since the book was written, which is kaning base nato inani na data sa the modern Principalia, the historical evolution of the Philippine ruling oligarchs, the plight of the Philippine masses has remained as miserable as ever because of the great disparity of incomes in the Philippines. Almost 80% of its population is living between the poverty line. And that is the truth. That would be the end of my report. Bye-bye.